Hey everybody, it's Physics O'Clock. So today we're going to be looking at quite a substantial number of books about women physicists from the 17th century up to today. And we're going to get started with, well, do you want to call her a physicist or not? Since the era that she lived in didn't really have the word physicist, I think it's good enough. And that's the figure of Margaret Cavendish. She's this 17th century figure. She sort of locked horns with some of the greatest thinkers of her time. And she wrote, with Descartes and Hobbes and all these guys, took them to task for their ideas about animals and other things. But what's interesting is that she wrote these kind of science epic poems about her ideas about physics and how the galaxy works. She was not admitted to join the Royal Society, but to witness a meeting of the Royal Society, which was unheard of at the time. So she was just this sort of scientific center in the 17th century world, right around the time that England was dealing with all of its issues. This book by Douglas Grant sort of conveys the very rarefied atmosphere that she lived in. She was not only a sort of science icon and a drama icon and a philosophy icon, but also like this massive fashion icon for the 17th century. And this book goes into that as well. So it's a really cool one. Laura Bassey was probably the person that you think of when you try and think of like the earliest woman physicists that you know. You probably think of Laura Bassi, 18th century figure from Italy. And she was one of the people responsible for trying to bring this new science of Newton and all that crowd into a very kind of stodgified Italian academic scene. And the tragedy of it is that, she's, admitted to the University of Boulogne. And then is basically, as soon as they admit her, they're like, your science stuff's nice, but why don't you just write poetry all the time? So she gets in, she fights her way in, she defends her theses, they're brilliant, and then they're like, what we're really interested in is your poetry, could you please write that and stop, challenging how we do science here? And that whole sort of tale is told in Monique Friese's Laura Bassi and Science in 18th Century Europe. And it's a really good read. It gets you into that whole scene of, if you're out on the periphery and you have this brand new way of doing science, how do you convince people to do that? How do you convince people that their way of doing science needs to be replaced with something totally new? And then how do you do it if you're an 18th century woman? It's a really interesting account for that. So this is another great one to have. Hertha Ayrton, or Ayrton, I don't know if you know how to pronounce it, tell me, is a really diverse sort of figure in what she did. A lot of people know her primarily as a figure in 19th century feminism, in the suffrage movement, but if you're a women in science person, then you primarily know her as the person who did the main refinements on the idea of the electric arc light, those lights which are then used as searchlights in the First World War and as stage lighting in movies. But then she also did a bunch of other stuff in fluid dynamics. So she was interested in how ocean currents create the little patterns on the bottom of the ocean, and then she took that expertise and created this fan that, had the British adopted it in a timely fashion, would have been incredibly effective in getting poison gas out of the trenches, but they didn't. They sort of this was great, we're not going to do it. Until basically the war was over, and then they were like, this is great, we should have done this. She's like, good timing, guys. The book to have for this is Hertha Ayrton, A Memoir by Evelyn Sharp. This copy is from 1926. I don't know if there are newer editions of it. I'm sure it's available as a reprint, but you can get the originals. They're still around. It's not the hot ticket item that you might be expecting. But this is close to her time period, and so has a lot more appreciation for the diversity of what she did. So it's a really neat book for a figure who has multiple influences on history, not just science, but on political history as well. So yeah, do a search. It's a cool one. Marie Curie. There are so many books about Marie Curie. I'm putting her in physics instead of chemistry, more or less randomly. I could be dead before I get to do the chemistry one, so might as well do it here. And there are tons and tons of books about her. There's probably going to be a whole separate episode about just Marie Curie biographies, so I'm just going to pick my favorite. And that is Marie Curie, A Life by Susan Quinn. And what I like about her approach to Curie is that it is like all of Quinn's stuff. She's written several biographies, and each one of which is worth getting. She's very good at background stuff. So she goes in depth into the background of Poland at the time of Marie Curie's youth, and what it was like being in a state that was essentially being closely monitored, if not run, by Russia, where if you were a Polish child, you couldn't speak your own language in school. You had to learn your history from the point of view of Russia's telling of it. And if you wanted to learn, you kind of took part in these flying universities where people would just gather at different houses to learn sort of, surreptitiously different things. And Curie was part of that whole scene, and it informed a number of aspects of her later life. I like Quinn a lot. She doesn't over-romanticize Curie. She doesn't sensationalize her life like a lot of biographies do. It's just a straight, stone-cold telling of, one of the most remarkable scientists of all time. So if I had to choose one, that's the one to get. Then, of course, you get Marie Curie's daughter, Irene Joliot-Curie. There is much less written about her, but luckily one of the books that is written about her is one of the most sort of charming, delightful books that there is in women in science literature. You don't always get this. You don't always get really charming, enjoyable to read books. But this is certainly one, and it's Noël Loriot's Irene Joliot-Curie. It's in French. I don't know if there's an English translation. A better person would have looked it up ahead of time, but this is the one that I've got, and it is just so charmingly written. And I don't know if that's an artifact of just things in French just tend to be charming when you read them. Like, even things that are really, terrible and dull, the fact that it's in French kind of makes it like, ooh, this is fun. But it is. It just goes. Her character, her accounting of what it was like being a kid in the Curie household, and being taken from famous scientist to famous scientist who kind of taught you personally their parts of the world, and being this very, very serious daughter who is desperate to prove herself and prove her scientific worth, and kind of these accounts of her looking around corners at people who visited Marie, and sort of scowling at them because they were taking time away from her time with her mom. It's just very charming. And then you get into the science of it, which is her almost making revolutionary scientific discoveries once and then again. So it was with the recoil phenomenon, which we're going to get to, and with nuclear fission. All of these things were almost discovered by Irene Curie, but then eventually she does discover with her husband the phenomenon of artificial radioactivity or induced radioactivity, and that puts her name on the map and gets her the Nobel Prize. And this account is just wonderful. So get it, and if there's an English translation, let me know so I can, recommend that to people instead of saying, learn French, and then read this. Harriet Brooks is one of my personal favorites. I think that she's just awesome in so many different ways. And there's a book by a classic couple in women in science writing, the Rayner Canhams, or Conhams again, I don't know. But when it comes to sort of mid 20th century women in science writing, there's like 5 or 6 people who were really doing it at that time. And this couple was one of them. They have a great book about the history of women chemists. And then they have this standalone volume about Harriet Brooks, who was a phenomenal nuclear scientist. The rival of Curie in many ways, especially considering that she didn't have that many years that she did it. She was sort of this revolutionary figure. She did her nuclear stuff, but then she also hung out with, interesting literary figures. And then she does what a lot of people do. She gets married, and then that's kind of it. She gets dragged into a relationship where she's not allowed to do science anymore, really. And that whole story of that kind of just, fading away of this figure prevented from doing, living this life that she had known, this life of discovery, this life of intellectual adventure. It's a really tragic one, and they tell it very well. So yeah, this is, out of these guys that I'm going to say, this is in kind of my top 3 of ones to pick up. Mileva, Marich, Einstein. I get more hate mail about having covered this person than any other at all. Like, it's all her. Everything else I tend to get from people is very nice and supportive and wonderful. Like, oh, thanks for covering this figure. But overwhelmingly, if it's somebody who is just going to be abusive and terrible, they're talking about her. And that's because she touches on the life of Albert Einstein, is that if you read about her, you read about how Albert Einstein was and about sort of the terrible things he did in his personal life, how he treated her, how he treated his first daughter, who he basically compelled her to give away, how he abandoned her with a violent schizophrenic son who he would have nothing to do with, in order that he could then marry his much less intellectually challenging cousin. Albert Einstein does not come off well when you talk about the life of Mileva, because it's essentially episode after episode of him just doing horrible things to this poor woman. But then you get into it, the fact that she was very important to his early career. And assessing the degree of that importance is what gets people fired up in really angry and ugly ways. I'm not going to assess that here, but I will turn you to sort of the centerpiece of all of this, the one that kind of started the whole controversy, is this one, by Dasanka, Trebuchovich, Gurich. I did not pronounce that correctly at all, but I'm not going back. I think the original is in German. This is the French translation, because for the longest time when I was trying to get this, the German one was like $90 to get, and I'm like, nope, not on a teacher's salary. So I got the French version instead, which is much more reasonable to find, and it goes through all of these claims about the degree of responsibility that she should take in his earliest discoveries. And yeah, there's a lot to be debated about that, but if you want to start the debate, and especially a lot of people that call into question some of the ideas in here, but this is where you start. if you're going to be talking about that. There's also a kind of sort of novel kind of thing. Um, it's called Einstein in Love, a scientific romance, which is about them, and it is in English. So that's another one you can kind of, if German and French aren't on your radar, this can kind of get you there. The other one is here. Ah! Why am I crunkling? Um, oh, that's sad. Um, yeah, these are these little space erasers that I throw at students when they say something smart. And I guess they were in this jacket. The the last time that that I was teaching before COVID broke out. I haven't had a chance to throw them at anybody since then. Because I can't. Oh, you're behind me. Okay. Yeah, you can't throw at people through Zoom. What the heck was I talking about? Now I'm sad. Okay, yes. Einstein's Wife is an account of several different women and sort of talking about the impact that marriage has. In life, if you're a woman in these different time periods that she's talking about. And this one pulls a lot from the French German from Gurich's book. And it's also in English. So if you want just like a 30-page kind of summary of the whole issues, that's that. So yeah, there we go. Lisa Meitner. If there's a second figure in the history of physics that you know besides Marie Curie, it's probably Lisa Meitner. One of the most outstanding minds of the 20th century. Of course, the person, the sort of co-discoverer of nuclear fission, even though she was, as a part of the post-war scene where Germany was trying to rehabilitate itself. Basically, credit for that got apportioned to Otto Hahn, her partner, and she was sort of written out of the story for a long time. Her life is told in one of my favorite books, Lisa Meitner, A Life in Physics, by Ruth Syme. And this is an intriguing book because a lot of biographies of women in science, or a lot of biographies of scientists in general, or coverage of science in general, kind of starts from the principle that, we know what ended up happening and what ended up being true. And so we're going to tell this story in the vocabulary of the stuff that turned out being right. And when people did something wrong, we're going to explain it based on the terminology of what ended up being right. This is not her approach. Her approach is, okay, we don't know what's right. We haven't figured that out yet. So therefore, you, the reader, shouldn't yet know what's right either. And so you're just going to be kind of going along with Meitner in this discovery, trying to figure out all this weird, anomalous stuff that doesn't make sense in the context of the things that you know. We're going to explain it to you in the terms that those people knew, which you as the reader don't know because you know the modern way that all this stuff is explained. So it is a real kind of detective story that even if you know a lot of stuff about nuclear fission and the development of early 20th century nuclear physics, it's still going to be a lot of like, oh, where's this going? Does that mean that she won? Is it wrong? What's happening? I don't know these explanations from this time. So it's really different. A lot of people are put off by that, I think, because they are like, don't tell me in the stuff that didn't, in the terms of the ideas that didn't work. That's too hard. Please tell me in the terms that I know about, please. But I think it's a really interesting way to do it, and it keeps that sort of tension going in a very interesting way. So yeah, it's a really neat way to write a book. So yeah, check it out. Maria Goeppert-Meyer, you know her through her work with nuclear stability, this idea of nuclear shells that we can talk about, just like we talk about electron shells, that we can talk about nuclear shells as well, and particular states of stability for the nucleus. And once you start doing the analysis that way, you start understanding why some nuclei are stable and others less so. So in terms of understanding atoms and the existence of different atoms and their isotopes in our universe, she is a central figure. To my knowledge so far, as of the last time that I checked, there's not just a full book devoted to just her. So one of the places that you can look that has a good at least third of a book devoted to her is A Life of One's Own by Joan Dash, Three Gifted Women and the Men They Married. So this is Margaret Sanger, it's Edna St. Vincent Millay, and the last section of it is Maria Goeppert-Meyer. And sort of, you know, the trials of being married to somebody who does something in the area that you do work in the early 20th century, when strict nepotism laws were in place, whereby if you were a physicist and your husband was a physicist and you went to a university, they would take him, give him a full professorship, and then if you were very, very lucky, they would take you on in an unpaid role where you kind of had to do what work you could. And a lot of women scientists that you see in this era kind of had to make that sort of deal. Some, their husbands fought for equal representation for them. Others were sort of either didn't care or were too unstable. They're just starting in their careers, so they don't want to make waves. So yeah, her life is in this volume, and then her contributions to nuclear shell theory are as well. So it's not the easiest one to find. It's what, 1973? But for right now, it'll have to do. It's memoir time. And whereas in a lot of places we don't have many memoirs at all of people actually, of women scientists actually writing down their experiences, this one we have a few. It's not as many as we'd like, but it's a few. One of the more interesting ones is Leona Marshall Libby's The Uranium People. And it's her account of, you know, it doesn't have as much about herself as you'd like. This was written in 1979. But it's her account of the various people who contributed to the Manhattan Project. She was the only woman scientist or woman physicist on the Manhattan Project. And so it's her accounting of sort of her experiences, not only there, but it also goes into a lot of detail about the people that she worked with. So there's a lot about Enrico Fermi and those sorts of chaps in here. Hard to find for a decent price. At least it was, 3 years ago when I was looking for it. There weren't many published, or printed rather, and of those, there weren't that many that people kept, and that are still up. They're sort of all over the place in private collections right now where people won't give them up, just like I won't until I'm dead. So you're not getting this one, but yeah, you're going to have to kind of put this as it's going to take a while to find one, but it's an interesting account when you do. Joan Freeman's A Passion for Physics is about her time first. So she's another figure in World War II, sort of Australian radar development. So we covered another when we were doing astronomy. She does not, however, go into the whole, well, I did radar works, now I'm going to do radio astronomy. Rather, what she does is, I did radar work during the war, I'm really, really good at building incredibly precise devices. Um, I'm going to go into I'm going to go into nuclear physics because that seems like the place where the most fundamental things are happening, and where somebody with, my gifts for developing measuring devices and developing new tools would be useful. So yeah, Joan Freeman's book is an account of that, her dual career as a wartime radar sort of development engineer, and then how she transported that into being a nuclear researcher after the war. So just a really cool life that I'm very thankful she wrote down for us. And then finally, another one kind of off the radar is Fey Eisenberg-Salova's A Matter of Choices. And she was another mid-20th century figure. She was sort of the nerve center for nuclear measurements in that time. So she was responsible for kind of putting together all of the data along with her own research, but everybody else's research, as everybody is kind of probing the nucleus and all the nucleus of all these different atoms, and getting the most up-to-date measurements of all the different aspects of these guys. This just mammoth process that she oversees for decades as the kind of nerve center of all of that. So kind of like Agnes Mary Clerk was in the 19th century with astronomers and astrophysicists, she's kind of that in the mid-20th century with nuclear researchers. And this is her account of her family's journey and hers as well. And it's another really neat one that I'm glad we have. And so we move to today. And the good news is that there are all kinds of women physicists writing about the work that they do and writing about their lives, not only in book form, but of course all over the place in Twitter. This is, 60% of my Twitter is women scientists and the work that they're doing right now, probably 80%. So there's tons and tons of stuff about what's going on today to read. Unfortunately, most of that is buried over there, and if you watch the math video, you'll know that over there is a land populated by dragons and garbage. But the books are all under that. So I'm just going to share a few that happen to be in the primary Women in Science bookshelf and not the secondary and tertiary Women in Science bookshelves. Starting with Sabina Haasenfelders' Lost in Math, a really interesting book about maybe we've gone down the wrong road in physics research. Maybe we've been seduced by the idea of mathematical elegance, and that's led us to put more and more and more money into things that are producing less and less valuable results. And maybe we should do a fundamental rethink about how we do physics research in the world. And it's a really, people argue this a lot. There's a lot of drama on the internet around this book. But it's a good one to read. I have my students read it, from time to time in order to kind of really make them think about, are you just going along with the road because everybody else says that elegance is the main thing? Or are there other ways to do physics out there? And is it okay to want to do other types of physics research? So it's a really good one for that. Another area in modern physics, which is, I wouldn't say dominated, but yeah, dominated by women scientists and women physicists, is neutrino research. I did a piece, I think probably 4 years ago now, that was just a dozen figures in neutrino research who are these top rank figures in their fields, doing the central experiments and parts of these central experiments, and this history that stretches back for decades of women leading in this field. There's not, unfortunately, a book about that, but there's a book that contains a number of them in it, and that's Neutrino Hunters. And it's a book just about the first idea of the neutrino, its development, and then the people who design the devices, which reveal its increasingly strange behavior. So it's a really cool book, and it's fun. There's others. There's the Lisa Randalls out there, that are also over in that kind of world. And if you have some favorites, that I didn't talk about, drop by the Twitters, drop by the comments, and we can chat about those, and I can learn some new books to put on the shelves. In the meantime, next time we are going to be going into naturalists. So we'll probably do Naturalist Part 1 because there's a few. So we look forward to seeing you then. And in the meantime, you got some stuff to read. So get to it. See yous.